This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. Today, I'm going to give you my picks for the 10 worst cards in Standard right now. One of the recurring comments I've gotten on other worst top 10s is that those lists are largely filled with older cards, and that's true. These days, they design a lot fewer cards that are just awful in all of Magic's formats. Most of them are at least decent somewhere, and that's what leads to these lists being filled with older cards. In Magic's early days, they designed cards without thinking a whole lot about how good or bad a card might be. So that's why there's so many in the earlier days of the game. They're really feeling things out and trying to learn about card design. But those comments got me to thinking about doing a top 10 only on newer cards, and that's what we're doing today. Overall, you'll see that the cards on this list are a lot less bad than on a typical worst MTG top 10, and that's because the floor of Magic cards have really moved up over the years. However, that isn't to say that there aren't any bad cards these days. There certainly are, especially when compared to other cards from the recent past. To end up on this list, a card had to be bad in EDH, bad in 60-card constructed formats, and bad in limited. While the cards on this list and the order in which they appear is ultimately left up to my own opinion, I do use data to help me make my selections. For 60-card constructed, a card can't have finished in the top 8 of any remotely significant event. For EDH, a card can't be widely played in the format. This is information I get from EDH Rec. And lastly, for limited, I use data from 17 lands, which gives us the win rate for cards in more recent limited formats. For me, this is one of the cooler things about doing a list on more recent cards, as for other top 10s, there isn't much data to talk about how good or bad a card is in limited. But for more recent sets, we do have data that can help us. I've talked about 17 lands a lot in the limited content here on the channel, but suffice it to say, if you like limited and haven't checked out 17 lands at 17lands.com, you should. The data there is really helpful. But basically, the cards on this list are cards that you really don't want to be playing anywhere in any format. To be eligible for this video, a card had to be in Standard right now, with one exception. I chose to exclude Phyrexia All Will Be One, as the set is still very new, and there hasn't been enough time for us to determine the worst cards from that set. Alright, let's take a look at my picks for the 10 worst cards in Standard right now. At number 10, it is Celestis Sanctifier. You can see already that the cards in this list are significantly better than what we usually see on a worst list. I mean, the Sanctifier's base stats as a 3-mana 3/2 are way better than what we usually see. However, in today's context, a 3-mana 3/2 really isn't very good in any format, and a card needs to do something pretty significant to overcome that stat line. And Celestis Sanctifier just doesn't. It turns it into daytime, and anytime night becomes day, you get to look at the top 2 cards of your library and put one in your graveyard. That effect is far too minimal for what you pay for this card. It also doesn't really fit super well with anything White was actually doing in Midnight Hunt Limited, and as a result, it didn't really make the cut in the limited format. By the way, you can see that this card has a win rate of 51.6% in Midnight Hunt Limited. By the way, you can see that this card has a win rate of 51.4% in Midnight Hunt Limited, which might not sound like the worst thing ever. After all, if we take every single Magic's player's win rate, the number we get is 50%, since Magic is a zero-sum game. So, higher than 50% might not seem too bad. However, keep in mind that the users on 17 lands have an average win percentage much higher than 50%. People who use 17 lands tend to be the most enfranchised limited players around, who play a whole lot of every single format. On 17 lands, the community win rate is around 55%, so anything that is several percentage points behind that is pretty bad. And once we get below about 52%, it usually means a card is pretty much unplayable. So Celestis Sanctifier's 51.4% win rate is much worse than it might look at first. At number 9, it's Vampire Slayer. I know, this is a 2-mana 2/2. It can't be that bad, right? Well, just like with the Sanctifier, this stat line is a lot worse these days than it has been in Magic historically. In limited formats we play today, a vanilla 2-mana 2/2 just isn't good enough to make the cut, and that's certainly true in 60-card Constructed and EDH too. Unfortunately for Vampire Slayer, it is pretty much a vanilla creature. Yes, it does have a text box. When it damages a vampire, you get to destroy it. While certainly flavorful, that effect is incredibly underpowered. Even in Crimson Vow Limited, a format with lots of vampires, the Slayer wasn't good. Most of the vampires in the format die just as easily to any 2/2 as they did to Vampire Slayer. And those other 2/2s that could trade for other vampires usually did other things other than just having a really weak effect that hated on vampires. Basically, it just wasn't an ability that mattered. And Crimson Vow Limited was probably the best possible format for the Slayer too, and it still has an awful win rate there. At number 8, it is Wanderlight Spirit. This is another card that offers a fairly reasonable stat line as a 3-mana 2/3 flyer. That isn't a horrible place to start, but you are sort of expecting a creature with that stat line to avoid having a downside these days and at least be French vanilla, and the Wanderlight Spirit doesn't get there because it can't block creatures without flying. This is a reasonable attacker in the air, but a complete liability in situations where it can't attack. The turn you play it and pass the turn to your opponent, it is almost like you haven't added to the board at all, despite using a card and spending mana, and that isn't what you want to be doing. It's extra notable that Crimson Vow Limited had a spirit theme, and Wanderlight Spirit still had an awful win rate in the format. At number 7, it is Tattered Apparition. Alright, now we are talking about a stat line that has been pretty bad for basically the entire history of Magic. A 4-mana 2/2 flyer has never been a card you're excited about. By the time you play it, other large flyers or reach creatures are likely to be in play, and it dies to a lot of 1-mana removal, which is a massive tempo hit for you to take. The apparition does come with the typical Shade ability to buff its stats, but it asks for a lot of mana to do it, and it isn't like what you're getting out of the apparition in the end is that impressive anyway. I will say that it does have the highest 17 lands win rate of any card on this list, and it's the least awful in limited, but it still wasn't really a card that consistently made the cut. At number 6, it is Maestro's Initiate. This gives us another fairly unimpressive stat line as a 3-mana 3/1, and while it's in play, it doesn't bring anything else to the table. After it ends up in your graveyard, you can pay 5 mana to exile it and draw 2 cards and discard a card. That effect in itself isn't bad, but the amount of mana you have to spend to do it is way too high, especially because you also paid too much for the creature in the first place. In other words, it is super inefficient in both things that it does, and that's what made it so bad in all formats. Now, I do think the Initiate had a chance to maybe be a better card if it showed up in a slower limited format, but Streets of New Capenna was so fast that this card was really bad, and we are of course talking about each of these cards in the context of their own limited formats, so it doesn't really matter that this might have been a little less terrible in a slower format. Even in that sort of situation, while it might have been better, it still wouldn't have been good. At number 5, it is Barkweave Crusher. This is a 4-mana 2/5. That's not a terrible stat line, but they also weren't good enough for this card to see play in any format if that's all it was. It does come with Enlist, which means you can sometimes boost the power on this thing when it attacks by tapping down another creature, but overall the Enlist mechanic ended up being a pretty big dud. It was definitely upside, especially on creatures who had keyword abilities and things like that, but it wasn't huge upside, and all the Crusher offered was high toughness. It was usually just better to leave it back and swing with your other things than it was to enlist this, and just leaving back a vanilla 2/5 isn't very good in the first place. At number 4, it is Retrieval Agent. Like Barkweave Crusher, the Agent is a 4-mana 2/5, but it has an ability that I think is even less upside than Enlist is. You can pay 2 mana to give it +1/-1 until end of turn. The idea here is that you can leave the Agent back as a blocker when you need to, but because you can adjust its stats, it can also attack somewhat decently. Now, I say the idea here because it didn't really work out that way. The Brothers War Limited was a format that was largely about adding to the board every single turn, and pumping mana into this didn't do a good job of letting you do that. What's more is there were plenty of far more efficient creatures at similar mana costs that didn't demand you sink mana into them every turn for them to be relevant as attackers. This card is extra bad because there were 2 things going on in the Brothers War that you would think might make it a little better. There were Power Stones, which could be used to pay for the ability, and Blue-White was a Soldier Tribal deck. However, despite those things, Retrieval Agent was still a card you never played in Limited, and you shouldn't be playing it in any other formats either. At number 3, I have Thanos' Tinkering. This 4 mana instant lets you put 2 +1/+1 counters on an artifact, creature, or land, and untap it. If it wasn't already a creature, it makes that permanent into a 0/0 creature. So this can allow you to buff something that already is a creature, or it can allow you to animate a land or artifact into a 2/2. That is kind of a cool design because it can do all of those different things. And in a vacuum, that effect certainly isn't bad, but 4 mana is just way too much for this effect. When you see a card like this, it is easy to imagine ideal scenarios when it helps you win combat or lets you do lethal by suddenly animating something into a creature, and sure, those things can happen, but there are far more scenarios where you spend 4 mana to cast this and you don't get a full card worth of value back. Or worse, your opponent pays far less mana to get a 2-for-1 by using a more efficient trick on their own creature or destroying yours in response. And make no mistake, the Brothers War Limited had tons of ways to do that. It is notable that of all the cards on this list, Thanos' Tinkering is seeing the most play in EDH, but I think that probably has to do with how unique the effect is. And I think that number is probably going to come down in coming months as people realize that this card is pretty bad in EDH too. At number 2, it is Philaji Chain Dancer. Of all the cards on the list, the Chain Dancer has the lowest win rate on 17 lands. This 4 mana 2/4 starts out behind the 8 ball with that stat line, and it comes with an ability that is very mediocre. Sure, gaining Double Strike can be a powerful thing, but having the 2 mana to pay for it is far from a foregone conclusion, especially in Limited. And on turns when you can't use the ability, and there are lots of those, it is an incredibly bad creature. Like with Retrieval Agent, you might have thought the presence of Power Stones in the format would mean you'd be able to use this ability a bit more, but it just didn't shake out that way. Playing this card had an incredibly negative effect on your win rate. However, there is one card in Standard right now that I think is even worse, and that is Keeper of the Cadence. The Keeper is a 5 mana 2/5, not a stat line you want, but it has an ability with a whole bunch of words. Surely that'll make up for it, right? No. You can pay 3 mana to put an artifact, instant, or sorcery from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. Now, there are corner cases where this does something, like if your opponent has a card with one of those types in their graveyard and they're trying to get it back from their graveyard, or if you want to get a powerful card from your graveyard back into your library, or if the game goes so long that you can use this to keep yourself from milling out. In fact, if you reach that point of the game, you can basically use this to choose what you draw each turn, which can be pretty funny. Those are definitely several situations where the ability matters, but each of those situations comes up an extremely low percentage of the time, and certainly doesn't make a 5 mana 2/5 worth running in any format. So yeah, I think this is the worst card in Standard right now. So those are my picks for the 10 worst cards in Standard right now. If you want to own any of these cards, because maybe you want to prove me wrong, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to stay aware of future videos, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to see some of the over 550 other MTG top 10s, including dozens more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.